So again, this is my final Bible study for St. Mark's.
Yeah.
I could do one on Sunday morning, but I don't think I will.
Yeah.
Uh, Candy, who usually shows up, is out of town, I know, and so I'm like, I'm not gonna.
Is she on a cruise? Somebody
Yeah.
said she was on a cruise.
Yeah.
Good.
Yeah.
So
So
where?
we are
Where
on
are we?
Nehemiah chapter 8.
Oh, okay, right.
And I'm going to go back because to me it's important. So whether it's important to you or not, I kind of want to highlight how the history books are organized, because I've learned this kind of as we've gone through this. So there's kind of three different timelines. Joshua, Judges, Ruth, Kings, those are all Samuel and Kings. Those are all one timeline essentially, from the time the people enter the Holy Land until just about the time of the Babylonian exile. One timeline, and it's like 8 books, 10 books, whatever it is. And it's pretty detailed, right? It has all of the sort of this all the different kings, the rulers, and what happened and all that stuff. Chronicles, the 2 books of Chronicles, cover that same block of time, but do it in a much more abbreviated manner. It talks about David and Solomon and all the kings in between, but it just jumps through them a lot quicker. Ezra and Nehemiah are actually pretty unique in the sense that they are books of history from the time after the exile in Babylon. So the only other books that we know were written in that time, most of our books of the prophets were written that time, but it's a different style of writing. It's hard to call it historical, although there are things in there, like in Jeremiah, there's details about the rebuilding of the temple. It's done in a different kind of writing style, so it's kind of hard to follow the narrative, because that's not how the prophets wrote, right? The neat thing about Ezra and Nehemiah is it's still a narrative. It's still this sort of story about the return of the people to the Holy Land, and it's the only ones in that period of time. Ezra was written from the perspective of Ezra, who was a priest, someone who was in the temple, and about him rebuilding the temple. So his focus was on the temple and on the moral improvement of the people, right? Nehemiah might be the most unique of the history books in the sense that it's writing about Nehemiah was one of the early sort of governors of the people, and it's writing from the perspective of rebuilding the city in a practical way, because he's literally talking about who's there and how they're dealing with land disputes and how they're dealing with production of crops and where people are and how they're. And it's still a faith perspective, but not the same as Ezra. So it's kind of interesting in that sense. Nehemiah is kind of just trying to physically get the city rebuilt. The last week there was about a chapter and a half that talked about them literally just rebuilding the city walls bit by bit by bit, putting the blocks of stone on top of each other again, and having each family have a section of the wall that they're rebuilding. It's kind of neat just to see the community coming together and literally rebuilding the city block by block. So that is where we were last week. This chapter 8 of Nehemiah mentions Ezra, which is interesting. So Ezra and Nehemiah, the books of Ezra and Nehemiah, parallel. So while Ezra is focused on the temple and the morality of the people, Nehemiah is focused on the city in general. And so they cross paths, which is kind of almost unique in Scripture. You don't hear in many places in Scripture someone from one book being mentioned in another book, right? Unless it's 2 books talking about a separate person, but someone from one talking about the writer of another, and that's because that was Ezra's area was the temple and the morality of the people, and Nehemiah was like, Ezra's got that. Let me take care of the rest of the city. So it's kind of interesting to see that. So we are in chapter 8. When the 7th month came, the people of Israel being settled in their towns, all the people gathered together into the square before the water gate. They told the scribe Ezra to bring the book of the law of Moses, which the Lord had given to Israel. Accordingly, the priest Ezra brought the law before the assembly, both men and women, and all who could hear with understanding. This was on the first day of the 7th month. So let me stop for just a second. When he says he brought the law, what does that mean? Do you know?
The Ten Commandments.
It probably means he brought the 5 books of the
Okay.
which is also referred to as the law sometimes. So
Mhm.
so the there's 3 different names for the Torah. The Torah, the Pentateuch, which is literally the 5 books, the 5 writings, and then the law.
Mhm.
It's probable what he's bringing is those first 5 books and reading from those first 5 books for the people. So there's a point at when Jesus says something about you didn't pay attention to the law and the prophets. He's not talking about paying attention to the laws that are written. He's saying you didn't pay attention when what was read from the law, which is the Torah, and what was read from the prophets, the books, right? The scrolls. So he's not talking about the people. He's talking about these books that they should have been paying attention to, which is kind of, so law, when he's saying the law, it's probably the Torah they're talking about. Verse 3, he read from it facing the square before the water gate from early mid-morning until midday, in the presence of the men and women and those who could understand, and the ears of all the people were attentive to the book of the law. The scribe Ezra stood on a wooden platform that had been made for a purpose, and beside him stood Mattithiah, Shema, Ananiah, Uriah, Hilkiah, and Maaseiah on his right hand, and Pedaiah, Mishael, Malchiah, Hashum, Heshbaddanah, Zechariah, and Meshullam on his left hand. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. How many people is that total?
10, 12.
12.
Mhm.
12.
10.
Remember, 12 is an important number for the Jews, not just the disciples for Jesus, but the 12 tribes of Israel. Having 12 sort of people there, even if they weren't from each of the 12 tribes, it represents that the 12 tribes, that all the people were there, essentially. Even if they weren't from each of the 12 tribes, there's a significance to having 12 people there with him. And Ezra opened the book in the sight of all the people, for he was standing above all the people. And when he opened it, all the people stood up. Then Ezra blessed the Lord, the great God, and all the people answered, Amen, Amen, lifting up their hands. Then they bowed their heads and worshiped the Lord with their faces to the ground. Also, that list of people helped the people to understand the law while the people remained in their places. So they read from the book, from the law of God with interpretation. They gave the sense so that the people understood the reading. And Nehemiah, who was the governor, and Ezra the priest and scribes, and the Levites who taught the people, said to all the people, This day is holy to the Lord your God. Do not mourn or weep. For all the people wept when they heard the words of the law. Then he said to them, Go your way, eat the fat, and drink sweet wine, and send portions of them to those for whom nothing is prepared. For this day is holy to our Lord, and do not be grieved, for the joy of the Lord is your strength. So the Levites stilled all the people, saying, Be quiet, for this day is holy, do not be grieved. And all the people went their way to eat and drink and to send portions and to make great rejoicing, because they had understood the words that were declared to them. I want to back up for just a second, and there's an important reason here. What, outside of there being laws in Deuteronomy, what is the summarize the Torah for me? Summarize 5 books for me.
Explain briefly and in detail everything you know about the Torah.
Basically, think about it. The Exodus starts in the book of Exodus, right?
Mhm.
And doesn't end until the end of the 5th book, Deuteronomy. So they are wandering in the desert for 4 of the 5 books, essentially. So a big portion of the Torah is about the people finding their place, finding their home, right?
You see Betty Lou?
No,
She said she's on.
she's not.
She's trying to get on.
Okay,
Did you send out a link, right?
I did not. I didn't have time, but I could
Oh.
send. It's the same link every week.
Okay, I'll send it to her then.
Okay.
Okay.
So 4 of the 5 books, plus even some of Genesis, is essentially about the people finding the place that's theirs, finding their home. So
Can I say something real quick?
yeah,
You said the Torah starts with Exodus.
no, the
No.
Torah starts with Genesis.
Okay.
Oh, okay, Genesis. Okay.
I
I
said
thought you
the
said
Exodus story starts in Exodus.
Oh,
and
okay.
runs through the end of Deuteronomy, runs through all those the other 4 books.
Okay, that all right.
They
Thank
leave
you.
Egypt. They leave Egypt in Exodus, and they don't get to the Holy Land until the end of Deuteronomy, until just before.
Right.
So 4 of the 5 books of the Torah are about them wandering in the desert,
Mhm.
looking for a home, right? Where Genesis is kind of its own thing
Right.
in a way. It's not just the creation story. We think when we hear Genesis, we think of the creation story. It's a story of Abraham and Isaac. It's a story of Joseph, right, going to Egypt, and his, it's all of those, Moses, all of that's in Genesis, right? But the rest of the Torah is about them returning home.
Mhm.
So these people have just returned home from captivity in Babylon, and it doesn't say this explicitly, even my notes, but it seems to me that would be why they're celebrating, because
Right.
but for a couple generations they've been taken out of the land and they're returning home, just as Moses took the people to the promised land. So they're returning back to the promised land. Imagine if you hear those words again, right?
Right. It would hit home so much more,
Right.
than just, yeah, I understand. Now that's a perfect description too.
Yeah, it's kind of brilliant in a way of Ezra. Celebrate. You're back.
Mhm.
You're back in the land of your ancestors, right?
Mhm.
So that's pretty neat. Also, there's a mention there about send portions for those for whom nothing is prepared. Basically, they're saying take care of those who can't afford to get the food themselves. The poor, people from my notes say foreigners. Take care of other people that may not have means for themselves. There's Betty Lou.
Oh, there's Betty Lou, yeah.
So that's a pretty neat thing.
There she is.
Hi, Betty Lou.
Good morning. I'm sorry I'm late, but I didn't get my email.
I did not send it out. I'm sorry. I was running late this morning myself.
Yeah. Well, I thought something was wrong.
Always the same link, and I just sometimes forget to send it out. Well, I didn't forget today. I just had I was on phone calls for an hour and a half.
Yeah.
So the people are celebrating that they're back in the land, and they're celebrating by reading the story of coming to the land to begin with Moses. So we are chapter 8 of Nehemiah, verse 13 now.
Okay.
On the second day, the heads of ancestral houses of all the people with the priests and the Levites came together to the scribe Ezra in order to study the words of the law. And they found it written in the law, which the Lord had commanded by Moses, that the people of Israel should live in booths during the festival of the 7th month. And they should publish and proclaim in all their towns and on Jerusalem as follows. Go out to the hills and bring branches of olive, wild olive, myrtle, palm, and other leafy trees to make booths, as is written. So the people went out and bought them and made booths for themselves. Booths are like tents, kind of. So the people went out and bought them and made booths for themselves, each on the roofs of their houses and on their courts, and in the courts of the house of God, and in the square of the water gate and the square of the gate of Ephraim. And all the assembly of those who had returned from the captivity made booths and lived in them. For from the days of Jeshua, son of Nun, to that day, the people of Israel had not done so. There was very great rejoicing. And day by day, from the first day to the last day, he read from the book of the law of God. They kept the festival 7 days, and on the 8th day there was a solemn assembly according to the ordinance. So Betty Lee, we were just talking about how Nehemiah is about the people coming back from captivity in Babylon, and they've just spent time hearing the reading of the Torah, which is about the people coming into the Holy Land. A lot of it, most of it, right? It must have been it was a big celebration because reading that was sort of symbolizing that they were back home.
Okay,
As a people, which is pretty profound, I think. Pretty neat.
definitely.
Okay, so and then the Festival of Booths, which I don't totally understand, the Festival of Booths, and that began, it says, living for a week in huts commemorated the journeying in the wilderness. So, okay.
You know what? I always wondered what they meant by booths. And your just description reminds me of, the Apaches when they have the feast on the 4th of July, they put up what they call wiki-ups, which is, made out of branches and stuff and, covered up. And it's kind of just a temporary thing. And I always, I would always picture the booths that they built in the Bible as like the kinds you see at a fair.
Oh, right.
Not like a wiki-up. Yeah.
Yeah.
Now it gels. Now I understand.
It's more like tents, the Festival of Tents.
Yeah.
And the reason is they're celebrating the fact that for 40 years they wandered in the desert and they didn't have permanent structures.
Yeah.
Right.
And they finally settled in the land where they have stone houses, and they want to celebrate their history for having wandered.
Yeah.
Kind of bluntly,
And I wanted to say something too, and I missed this, and I'm sorry I did. But on chapter, excuse me, it was going back. It says, chapter 6 says further opposition to the rebuilding. So did some of them not want to rebuild?
So no. So what had happened in that chapter was, I didn't actually remember this. I didn't know this. Israel is still under Babylonian control, or I should say Persian control, because Persia conquered Babylon. So Israel is still under Persian control and has Persian governors.
Mhm.
So there are governors of areas around there who don't like the Jews are rebuilding their temple.
Right. Okay.
Even though the king of all of them, over all of them, has said,
Right.
rebuild your temple, some of the
Right.
governors are opposed to that.
Okay. So it wasn't the Jews that were opposed
No.
to rebuilding. It was the people around them.
So
Okay.
they don't like that the people are rebuilding their walls and their temple,
Right. Okay.
because they're afraid that means they'll rise up against the Persians later on, which
Mhm.
I don't know what the story is there, because I don't think we know. But by the time of Jesus, they're not under Persian control anymore, obviously.
Mhm.
In fact, they in between the Romans and the Persians, they have the Greeks conquer them, which we don't have anywhere in scripture. Because there's really nothing written from, well, we don't know, there is stuff written, but there's nothing historical written between 250 BC and the time of Christ, essentially, that we have. So we don't know. At some point in that time, the Greeks conquer Israel and hold it, and then later on the Romans come in and control. So, but at that point, it's the Persians. They've had somebody over them a lot of the time.
Okay.
They're not technically they can't technically rule their own land, at least at this moment, even though they're sort of rebuilding. Chapter 9. And now on the 24th day of this month, the people of Israel were assembled with fasting and in sackcloth and with earth on their heads. Then those of Israelite descent just separated themselves from all foreigners and stood and confessed their sins and the iniquities of their ancestors. They stood up in their place and read from the book of the law of the Lord of their God for a fourth part of the day. For another fourth, they made confession and worshiped the Lord their God. Then those people stood on the stairs of the Levites and cried out with a loud voice, the Lord our God. Then the Levites said, skip names again, stand up. I don't feel like there's a bunch of names. Stand up and bless the Lord your God from everlasting to everlasting. Blessed be your glorious name, which is exalted above all blessing and praise. And Ezra said, you are the Lord, you alone. You have made heaven the heaven of heavens with all their hosts, the earth and all that is on it, the seas and all that is in them. To all of them you give life, and the host of heaven worships you. You are the Lord, the God who chose Abram and brought him out of Ur of the Chaldeans and gave him the name Abraham. And you found his heart faithful before you and made with him a covenant to give to his descendants the land of the Canaanite, the Hittite, the Amorite, the Perizzite, the Jebusite, and the Girgashite. And you fulfilled your promise, for you are righteous. And you saw the distress of our ancestors in Egypt, and you heard their cry at the Red Sea. You performed signs and wonders against Pharaoh and all his servants and all the people of his land, for you knew that they acted insolently against our ancestors. You made a name for yourself which remains to this day. And you divided the sea before them so that they passed through the sea on dry land, but you threw their pursuers into the depths, like a stone into mighty waters. Moreover, you led them by day with a pillar of cloud, and by night with a pillar of fire, good to give them light on the way in which they should go. You came down also upon Mount Sinai and spoke with them from heaven, and gave them right ordinances and true laws, good statutes and commandments. And you made known your holy Sabbath to them, and gave them commandments and statutes and a law through your servant Moses. For their hunger you gave them bread for heaven, and for their thirst you brought water for them out of the rock. And you told them to go in to possess the land that you swore to give them. But they and our ancestors acted presumptuously and stiffened their necks and did not obey your commandments. They refused to obey and were not mindful of the wonders that you performed among them. But they stiffened their necks and determined to return to their slavery in Egypt. But you are a God ready to forgive, gracious and merciful, slow to anger, and abounding in steadfast love. Have you ever heard that phrase before?
Yeah.
In church every Sunday, just about. And you did not forsake them, even when they had cast an image of a calf for themselves and said, "This is your God who brought you up out of Egypt," and had committed great blasphemies. You in your great mercies did not forsake them in the wilderness. The pillar of cloud that led them in the way did not leave them by day, nor the pillar of fire by night that gave them light on the way by which they should go. You gave your good spirit to instruct them and did not withhold your manna from their mouths, and gave them water for their thirst. 40 years you sustained them in the wilderness so that they lacked nothing. Their clothes did not wear out and their feet did not swell. Their feet did not swell. That's interesting. And you gave them kingdoms and peoples and allotted to them every corner, so they took possession of the land of King Sihon of Heshbon and the land of King Og of Bashan. You multiplied their descendants like the stars of heaven and brought them into the land that you had told their ancestors to enter and possess. So the descendants went in and possessed the land, and you subdued them before the inhabitants of the land, the Canaanites, and gave them into their hands with their kings and the peoples of the land to do with them as they pleased. And they captured fortress cities and a rich land and took possession of houses filled with all sorts of goods, hewn cisterns, vineyards, olive orchards, and fruit trees in abundance. So they ate and were filled and became fat and delighted themselves in your great goodness. Nevertheless, they were disobedient and rebelled against you, and you cast your law behind their backs and killed your prophets who had warned them to return, warned them in order to turn them back to you, and they committed great blasphemies. Therefore, you gave them into the hands of their enemies who made them suffer. Then in the time of their suffering, they cried out to you, and you heard them from heaven. And according to your great mercies, you gave them saviors who saved them from the hands of their enemies. But after they had rest, they again did evil before you, and you abandoned them to the hands of their enemies. So they had dominion over them. Yet when they turned and cried to you, you heard from heaven. And many times you rescued them according to your mercies. And you warned them in order to turn them back to your law. Yet they acted presumptuously and did not obey your commandments, but sinned against your ordinances, by the observance of which a person shall live. They turned a stubborn shoulder and stiffened their neck and would not obey. Many years you were patient with them and warned them by your spirit through your prophets, yet they would not listen. Therefore you handed them over to the peoples of the lands. Nevertheless, in your great mercies you did not make an end of them or forsake them, for you are a gracious and merciful God. Now therefore, our God, the great and mighty and awesome God, keeping covenant and steadfast love, do not treat lightly of all the hardship that has come upon us, upon our kings, our officials, our priests, our prophets, our ancestors, and all your people, since the times of the kings of Assyria until today. You have been just in all that has come upon us, for you have dealt faithfully, and we have acted wickedly. Our kings, our officials, our priests, and our ancestors have not kept your law or heeded our commandments, and the warnings that you gave them. even in their own kingdom and in the great goodness you bestowed on them, and in the large and rich land that you set before them. They did not serve you and did not turn from their wicked works. Here we are, slaves to this day, slaves in the land that you gave to our ancestors to enjoy its fruit and good gifts. Its rich yield goes to the kings whom you have set over us because of our sins. They have power also over our bodies and over our livestock at their pleasure, and we are in great distress. He kind of summarizes all of the history.
Right, right.
Mhm.
You
I
did this,
noticed.
you did this, and we disobeyed, but you stayed with us. And then you did this for us, and we disobeyed, but you stayed with us.
Yeah.
And you did this. It's interesting to me how it ends. We're still slaves.
Mhm.
We may have been released from captivity in Babylon, but we're still slaves in our own land.
Mhm. Is it Cyrus that's the king still, or is it Darius the king?
Darius is the king now.
Darius the king now.
The implication is that Cyrus is only the king for a little while after they're released, and then Darius succeeds him.
Ah, okay.
So
All right, now, wasn't Daniel under the lifestyle of Darius? Wasn't he one of them? I
he
mean,
might have been, yeah.
mhm. Okay.
It might
What
be.
is there about 4 of them though that Daniel served
Might have
on?
been, there might be another. There might be another Darius. I don't know.
Okay.
Daniel's a funny book because it's a little hard to date.
Okay.
But Daniel, I think Daniel is post-exile. So, I mean, he's technically a prophet, but it's an unusual prophet book for a lot of reasons. Not the least of which, only half of Daniel's in the Bible, right?
No, I didn't know that.
There's another half that didn't get included.
Really?
No, I never heard that.
Yeah, yeah. Um,
So what was the reason for it to not be included?
it's in the Apocrypha, and there's other stories
Okay.
that are associated with it. It says probably it tells the story. Yeah, he's a Jewish exile in Babylon, but yet was probably written later on. So it's hard. Like it says here, probably in the 160s BC, but set in 600 because he's in exile. So it's kind of hard to say. Is it someone writing about something that happened, and I thought Daniel was the character was there and later on. It's a prophetic book, but it's a little different. So Daniel's part of the story, but sometimes Daniel the unless there's multiple Daniels, sometimes Daniel is mentioned as being there in captivity in Babylon, and sometimes it's mentioned that there's a Daniel who's also a prophet among the people post-exile, which seems a little strange, unless there's multiple Daniels. Interesting question, though. In fact, Daniel is listed in this next list of the officials. There's a name Daniel in there, but it could be a different Daniel. So I'm going to skip to verse 28 of I want to back up for just a second. The way this ends, remember I told you that they're still under Persian control, right?
Mhm.
They're not slaves anymore because they were slaves in Babylon. They've been released from slavery to go back to their land to build their temple and stuff, but they're still under Persian control. The Hebrew people, all throughout these history books, are known for kind of like saying, being under control of some other government and then rebelling against them. It feels a little bit like that's where they're headed now, right? And remember those other governors when Nancy brought up the other governors from chapter 6, they're Persian governors that are assigned to rule over these areas.
Mhm.
And they're not real happy. All these Jews, a few 100,000 of them, have just come back into the land to possess it again. So
Mhm.
maybe they're smart to be upset about that.
Look.
If the Jews are going to rise up. So we're going to start at verse 28. The rest of the people, the priests, the Levites, the gatekeepers, the singers, and the temple servants, and all who had separated themselves from the peoples of the lands to adhere to the law of God, their wives, their sons, and their daughters, all who have knowledge and understanding, join with their kin, their nobles, and enter into a curse and an oath to walk in God's law, which was given by Moses, the servant of God, and to observe and do all the commandments of the Lord our Lord, and his ordinance and his statutes. We will not give our daughters to the peoples of the land, or take their daughters for our sons. And if the peoples of the land bring in merchandise or any grain on the Sabbath day to sell, we will not buy it from them on the Sabbath or on a holy day, and we will forego the crops of the 7th year and the exaction of every debt. So, amongst religious groups, I would say, I mean, Christians are probably the least demanding of following the traditions, right? Not that we don't follow traditions, but Orthodox Jews are incredibly exacting in these things that we just read, right? Don't marry, don't work on the Sabbath. I have a friend who is a female Jewish I can't remember the name. A priest,
Like a rabbi?
rabbi, a
Oh.
female rabbi, and she says we're not allowed to flip light switches on the Sabbath. So we have to have our timers set the day before for the times we want our lights to be on, because that's considered work. We're not allowed to operate any kind of machinery, including cars or ovens. We can't cook on the Sabbath day. So there's a lot of rules, and they're super
Yeah,
strict.
well, their kitchens even have to have one set of dishes and all for prepare meat, and the other side of the kitchen has to be for fruits and vegetables and things like that, and they can't be contaminated.
Yeah. It's funny, I do that already. I have a cutting board that I only use for anything non-meat, and I have other cutting boards I use for meat. But because I've heard meat juices, once they get into a cutting board, that's what they are,
Well, I think a lot of their rules were, common sense
practical, yeah.
then. Yeah, but now they're probably not. But you know what these paragraphs remind me of is like, what good intentions, the road to hell is paved with good intentions. We promise to give when the neighboring people, we promise to do this, that they're going to fall back,
Well,
because they always do.
I agree. I think part of the problem is they make the rules too strict that makes it almost impossible to follow.
Yeah.
And then they don't follow it. It's just a vicious cycle. And then they don't follow it, and they say, "Oh no, we didn't follow it. God hates us." And then they make the rules even stricter, and then they can't follow the rules again, and then bad things happen. God hates us. We didn't follow. It's a vicious cycle. Never get out of it. It's interesting that, and I think some faiths are like that. Other faiths are like that, where they make the rules so strict to paint themselves into a corner, right? The flip side is sometimes I don't think sometimes Christianity has enough rules. At least our version of Christianity, we almost are too free to just kind of be ourselves, and morality is,
Yeah.
everybody has their own morality, right? Which I think is its own problem in a way. I mean, we look at our rules and we say, well, we should be good people and we should feed the poor and stuff, but whatever. If we don't, it's okay. I mean, I almost wish we were somewhere in between, maybe a little stricter with our adherence to following what God told us to do, but not to the point of being trapped in a cycle of, well, we couldn't quite do it, so we're horrible people and we're going to be punished by God, right? It's actually a difficult line to walk. What does God want from us, and how do we walk it, right? So verse 32, I am determined to finish the book of Nehemiah, but I'm going to skip some names in a little bit, so it'll help. We also lay on ourselves the obligation to charge ourselves yearly 1/3 of a shekel for the service of the house of our God, for the rows of bread, the regular grain offering, the regular burnt offering, the Sabbaths, the new moons, the appointed festivals, the sacred donations, and the sin offerings to make atonement for Israel, and for all the work of the house of our God. We have also cast lots among the priests, the Levites, and the people for the wood offering to bring it into the house of our God by ancestral houses at appointed times, year by year, to burn on the altar of the Lord our God, as is written in the law. We obligate ourselves to bring the first fruits of our soil and the first fruits of all fruit of every tree, year by year, to the house of the Lord. Also to bring to the house of our God, to the priests who minister to the house of our God, the firstborn of our sons and of our livestock, as written in the law, and the firstlings of our herds and our flocks. And to bring the first of our dough and our contributions, the fruits of every tree, the wine and the oil, to the priests, to the chambers of the house of our God, and to bring to the Levites the tithes from our soil, for it is the Levites who collect the tithes in all our rich rural towns. And the priests, the descendants of Aaron, shall be with the Levites, and when the Levites reclaim the tithes, and the Levites shall bring up a tithe of the tithes of the house of our God to the chambers of the storehouse. For the people of Israel and the sons of Levi shall bring the contribution of grain, wine, and oil to the storerooms of the vessels of the sanctuary are, and where the priests that minister and the gatekeepers and the singers are. We will not neglect the house of our God. This is a stewardship campaign with a that's what it is, right?
Yeah. Mhm.
It's we promise that we'll bring our offerings to church. That's what it is. Now there's one line in there. It's sort of, it's not accidental, it's intentional, but it sounds bad. We'll bring the firstborn of our sons and our livestock in for sacrifice. They don't mean they're going to kill them. Okay.
It means they're going to dedicate him to the service of the temple. Is that right?
Temple. Yes, the firstborn son was supposed to be dedicated to the service of the temple. Yeah. Jesus is the firstborn son, by the way. Jesus did have siblings. So, in fact, some of them ended up being bishops in the early Christian church. One of them, James, the biological brother or half brother of Jesus, becomes a very influential early bishop in the church. But Jesus is the firstborn. So Jesus is dedicated to the temple, technically. Whether he was officially or not, that was the tradition. So it's kind of interesting that he fulfilled it. In a way, Jesus, I mean, the story might have been exactly the same, but Jesus' role might have been different if Mary had already had a kid and hadn't been a virgin, right? And he had a brother or sister, and a brother especially, and he wasn't the firstborn son, because his role in the eyes of the family has changed, right? Not that that's the story, but it would be interesting to kind of think about. All right, chapter 11. Trust me, I'm going to do a lot of skipping here in the next couple chapters. Now the leaders of the people lived in Jerusalem, and the rest of the people cast lots to bring 1 out of 10 to live in the holy city of Jerusalem, while 9/10 remained in other towns. And the people blessed all those who willingly offered to live in Jerusalem. These are the leaders of the province who lived in Jerusalem, but the towns of Judah all lived on the property in their towns. And we skipped that family. And we skip the next family, and we skip the next family, and the next family, and the next family, and the next family, and we are to chapter 12. See how quickly I read chapter 11?
Wow, magic.
Basically, they're saying of each of the 12 tribes, 1/10 of those people left. So Jerusalem was the home of all the 12 tribes, and the other 12 tribes. Now, we don't have the land of the 12 tribes anymore, but we have descendants from all the 12 tribes. So they don't live in their own land necessarily, but they live in towns and cities around outside Jerusalem, and largely by themselves in tribes, at least in cities. They were in essentially like states before, but now they're in towns and cities, largely the same tribe as in one town or city, other than Jerusalem, where all 12 tribes are represented there. And then we list a list of priests and Levites. Going to verse 27. Ta-da-da! I just skipped a chapter and a half.
You're doing good.
Thank you. I planned ahead. I knew I would be skipping some things. You say, there's no way I'll finish the rest of this book.
Yeah.
But I know. There is a couple little things in the end of chapter 12, not the end of what I did, part of chapter 12 that are actually worth, well, we're on verse 27. There's a couple moments. So it says in verse 22, the recorder heads the priest until the reign of Darius the Persian, until the reign. So Darius is the king, but I think it's till the end of the reign of Darius. We had talked about that. When is there overlap between Cyrus and Darius? And I'm sure it's written somewhere, but it's sort of interesting that it gives you the timing of that. And now we are to verse 27. Now I have to read. I'm going to skip some things, but I'm going to read more. So now the dedication of the wall of Jerusalem, they sought out the Levites in all their places to bring them to Jerusalem to celebrate that dedication with rejoicing, with thanksgiving, with singing, with cymbals, harps, and lyres. Remember, the Levites is the tribe that didn't have a land, essentially. The tribe that the priests were supposed to come out of.
Mhm.
So they are the ones that Levites, even if they aren't officially in the temple, the Levites are the ones that family is the one in charge of the temple and in charge of the religious order. The companies of the singers gathered together from the circuit around Jerusalem and from the villages of the Netophatites, also from Beth Gilgal and the region of Geba and Asmaveth, for the singers had built for themselves villages around Jerusalem. And the priests and Levites purified themselves, and they purified the people and the gates and the wall. So I love this picture of, we hear people, they put, you have two things. They put ashes on their heads or they put dirt on their heads. And then later on, they put oil on their heads, right?
Mhm.
So and they're literally doing those things, right? I think we celebrate this during our year. I'll do a blessing. I'll make the sign of the cross on someone's forehead.
Mhm.
Or Ash Wednesday, we put ashes on our head. People put ashes on their heads, literally on their heads, to signify mourning,
Mhm.
to signify, disputes among the people, right? To frustrations, right? But they put not the sign of the cross, of course, but they put oil on their heads to signify celebration and rebirth and renewal.
Mhm.
So we still celebrate that in a way, which I think is lovely. So the end of this little section here, they purified the people and the wall. They literally, put probably scented oils on the wall to bless the wall, which is kind of neat.
Mhm.
And they gave thanks, and then all these people came that I'm skipping. And at verse 37, at the fountain gate in front of them, they went straight up by the stairs of the city of David at the ascent of the wall above the house of David to the water gate on the east. So they were going to all the gates and blessing the gates, and blessing the wall. And then verse 43, they offered great sacrifices that day and rejoiced. For God had made them rejoice with great joy. The women and children also rejoiced. The joy of Jerusalem was heard far away. Verse 44. On that day, men were appointed over the chambers for the stores, the contributions, the first fruits, and the tithes, to gather into them the portions required by law for the priests and Levites from the fields belonging to the towns. For Judah rejoiced over the priests and the Levites who ministered. They performed the service of their God and the service of purification, as did the singers and the gatekeepers, according to the command of David and his son Solomon. From the days of David and Asaph long ago, there was a leader of the singers, and there were songs of praise and thanksgiving to God. In the days of Zerubbabel and the days of Nehemiah, all Israel gave the daily portions for the singers and the gatekeepers. They set apart that which was for the Levites, and the Levites set apart that for which was for the descendants of Aaron. So they're having a party because they're back. They're finally. I think the implication is they've been back for a little while. I mean, at least a few. But they're finally sort of dedicating the rebuilding of the city. The gates have been rebuilt. The walls have been rebuilt. The temple is either has been rebuilt or is in the process of being rebuilt. Their homes have been rebuilt, and they are celebrating not just being back, but rebuilding their city. It's kind of
Mhm.
lovely. And then the next thing, foreigners separated from Israel. Okay. They're always trying to keep themselves apart and not learning to live with other people. All right. This is how it's going to end, including mixed marriages condemned. On that day, they read from the book of the Moses in the hearing of the people, and in it was found written that no Ammonite or Moabite should ever enter the assembly of God,
Oh,
because they did not meet the Israelites with bread and water, but hired Balaam against them to curse them. Yet our God turned the curse into a blessing. When the people heard the law, they separated from Israel all of those of foreign descent.
oh, wow.
You don't understand when this is read back then. This is like good for them, and I read it and go, "Oh, couldn't you just love?"
Yeah,
Anyway,
yeah.
now before this, the priest Eliashib, who was appointed over the chambers of the house of our God, and who was related to Tobiah, prepared for Tobiah a large room where they had previously put the grain offering, the frankincense, the vessels, and the tithes of grain, wine, and oil, which were given by commandment to the Levites, singers, and gatekeepers, and the contributions for the priests. While this was taking place, I was not in Jerusalem. For in the 32nd year of King Artaxerxes of Babylon, I went to the king. This is Nehemiah talking.
Mhm.
After some time, I asked leave of the king and returned to Jerusalem. I then discovered the wrong that Eliashib had done on behalf of Tobiah, preparing a room for him in the courts of the house of God. And I was very angry, and I threw all the household furniture of Tobiah out of the room. So he's mad because Tobiah decided he was going to live in this place that was meant for storage of the tithes. So he kicked him out. Then I gave orders, and they cleansed the chambers, and I brought back the vessels of the house of God with the grain offerings and the frankincense. It'd be like if Carol Oberholzer decided she and Paul were going to move into the sacristy and get rid of all the cloth and the vessels and stuff in there. They're going to move in there, and he
And
comes
drink all the wine and,
drink
you
all
know,
the wine.
yeah.
And I come back and say, "What are you doing? Get out of there!"
Yeah.
I came out. So that's basically what happened. It's silly, but they didn't know how to. In a way, they didn't know how to live. They were trying to figure it out. I also found out that the portions of the Levites had not been given to them. Remember, the Levites don't have a land, so they are to get some offerings from the other people that have land. So that the Levites and the singers who had conducted the service had gone back to their field. So I remonstrated with the officials and said, "Why is the house of God forsaken?" And I gathered them together and set them in their stations. Then all Judah brought the tithe of the grain, wine, and oil into the storehouses. And I appointed as treasurers over the storehouses the priest Shelemiah, the scribe Zadok, and the Pedaiah of the Levites, and as their assistant Hanan, son of Zakur, son of Mathaniah, for they were considered faithful, and their duty was to distribute to their associates. Remember me, O my God, concerning this, and do not wipe out my good deeds that I have done for the house of my God and for his service. So it's interesting that we switched, by the way, just as a literary point, to a first person, right? Nehemiah is the one talking now. Where he hasn't been before, but now he's talking again. I mean, from first person perspective. In those days, I saw in Judah people treading wine presses on the Sabbath and bringing in heaps of grain and loading them on donkeys, and also wine, grapes, figs, and all kinds of burdens, which they brought into Jerusalem on the Sabbath day. And I warned them at that time against selling food. Tyrians also, who lived in the city, brought in fish and all kinds of merchandise and sold them on the Sabbath to the people of Judah and in Jerusalem. Then I remonstrated with the nobles of Judah and said to them, "What is this evil thing that you are doing, profaning the Sabbath day? Did not your ancestors act in this way, and did not our God bring all this disaster on us and on this city? Yet you bring more wrath on Israel by profaning the Sabbath." When it began to be dark at the gates of Jerusalem before the Sabbath, I commanded that the doors should be shut and gave orders that they should not be opened until after the Sabbath. And I set some of my servants over the gates to prevent any burden from being brought in on the Sabbath day. Then the merchants and the sellers of all kinds of merchandise spent the night outside Jerusalem once or twice. But I warned them and said to them, "Why do you spend the night in front of the wall? If you do so again, I will lay hands on you." From that time on, they did not come on the Sabbath. And it commanded the Levites that they should purify themselves and come to and guard the gates to keep the Sabbath day holy. Remember this also in my favor, oh my God, and spare me according to the greatness of your steadfast love. So Nehemiah is making sure that they all follow the Sabbath by locking the doors and making sure that they're not, because they're not supposed to go out and buy things. They're not supposed to be, doing that.
Yeah.
He says, no, not today. Any day but today.
Remember, living that way as a young person, very young. With, the stores were simply not open
Mhm.
on Sabbath, on Sundays.
Yeah.
Mhm.
You know.
I
Right.
remember that. I remember those days.
I mean, there are some that are still that way.
Yeah,
There's some stores, if they're closed any day, it's usually Sunday.
yeah.
Mhm.
But it's interesting that I've noticed that there's some like restaurants, some like bars and restaurants sometimes are closed on Monday and Tuesday if they're closed because they get more business on the weekend.
Yeah, well, yeah.
And we still have blue laws in Roswell proper, but not in the county, which I think comes from that same thing. It's to remember the Sabbath. People say it's about not drinking on, like drinking or getting drunk, but you can still have alcohol. You can still drink. You just can't buy it. I think it's more about the Sabbath than it is about the
Yeah,
fact that it's alcohol. But that's just the remainder of trying to not, trying to follow the rules of not being open on having a Sabbath day. I think it's related to that anyway. Because otherwise, what does it matter? It's Sunday.
yeah.
Honestly, no one's going to go. Was there really a problem with people on their way to church buying a fifth of booze and drinking it in the car on the way to church? Like that's not the problem, right? It's not about them drinking booze on Sunday. It's about selling it and prioritizing other things ahead of God on Sunday. It's about
Right.
Right.
Having to work on Sunday, making your employees work on Sunday, that type of thing,
Yeah.
I mean, Hobby Lobby isn't open on Sunday.
Right. And Chick-fil-A.
Yeah.
Not that we have a
Oh, right, right. Yeah.
So we are last little section here, verse 23. In those days, I also saw Jews who had married women of Ashdod, Ammon, and Moab, and half of their children spoke the language of Ashdod, and they could not speak the language of Judah, but spoke the language of various people. And they contended with them and cursed them and beat some of them and pulled out their hair.
Oh,
You're culturally impure. Anyway, and I made them take an oath in the name of God, saying, "You shall not give your daughters to their sons, or take their daughters for your sons or for yourselves." Did not King Solomon of Israel sin on account of such women? Among the many nations there was no king like him, and he was beloved by his God, and God made him king over all Israel. Nevertheless, foreign women made even him to sin. Shall we then listen to you and do all this great evil and act treacherously against our God by marrying foreign women? And one of the sons of Jehoiada, son of the high priest Eliashib, and was the son-in-law of Sanballat the Horonite, I chased him away from me. Remember them, O my God, because they have defiled the priesthood, the covenants of the priests and the Levites. Thus I cleansed them from everything foreign, and established the duties of the priests and Levites, each in his work. And I provided for the wood offering at appointed times and for the first fruits. Remember me, O my God, for good. My Bible has this note in the commentary. Nehemiah's summary of his activities, this last 2 chapters, shows how well he would like to be remembered as a religious reformer rather than simply a civil governor and restorer of Jerusalem's walls. So he's a little bit of both, right? The earlier part of the book was him restoring the walls and rebuilding the physical city, and now he's also restoring the morality in a certain to some degree, at least helping Ezra do that. So that there is one more book of history technically, but we're not going to read it, obviously. It is the book of Esther. And I will tell you, and I'm very sincere in saying this, one of the most interesting books in all of Scripture. Read like a crazy novel with twists and turns and surprises and intrigue and is Esther. Esther's a great book to read until the last chapter. The last chapter is kind of bizarre. They win and they celebrate, and in their celebration, then they go out and they kill like 1 million people. That's how it ends. I'm like, so skip the very end, but Esther's a great book.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Interestingly, it's one of the few books, it's the only book in all of our scripture that doesn't mention God.
Hmm.
Not even once.
Hmm.
Doesn't mention worship of God, even once. It says people who were Hebrews, people who were people of God, but there's no worship of God or the mention of God once in the whole book.
Don't you wonder how it made it into the scripture?
Uh, that's a good question. They made decisions, right? And there were probably 10 times more books available to them, and they chose that.
Yeah.
I think it's because of the Jewish festival of Purim, Purim,
Yeah,
which is celebrated because of the book. So, hundreds of years after it was written, they're still celebrating the festival of Purim, and without the book of Esther, there's no establishment of the book, the festival.
Oh,
But it's a wildly, of all the books of history, all the ones we just finished reading over the last several months, it is the one that is the most historically sort of inaccurate. There's kings that existed over 1,000 years, and the details. It's not meant. My point is, it's not meant to be a historical book in some way. It's a novel, but it's a fantastic novel. It is very interesting and fantastic story.
Mhm.
Worth reading. So that's your homework. Read Esther.
Mhm.
And thus concludes my last Bible study for St. Mark's Lutheran Church.
Oh, well, thank you. I
Yes,
certainly enjoyed
thank
them.
you.
And Betty Lou will be leading Bible study next week.
I will what?
I think he's being
That's
honored.
news to me.
Well, I said earlier, you guys could have Bible study even if I'm not here. So think
Yeah.
about it. But I will see you later. I just saw Paul Oberholzer walk in. I haven't seen him in 6 months. So
They're
are
back?
they back in
well,
town?
yes, they are. So I don't know
Oh,
if it's,
wonderful.
I'm gonna go say
Well,
hi to him.
so I can see them.
Okay, if it's both of them, I will take them in here. Hold on a second.
All
Yeah,
right, yes,
thank you.
bring them in so we can see them.
Hey, Paul, come here and say hello to some people for a second. On my computer.
Oh,
It's Nancy, Judy, and Betty Lou.
hello.
Hi, Paul.
Oh,
Oh, it's good to see you.
Oh, good to see you too.
Well, good morning. Welcome back.
And we didn't get to Colorado.
no, I didn't figure you would. That's too far out of the way.
Uh,
Carol was gonna give you a call and say we weren't going through that way, so.
Yeah, yeah.
Well,
Well, it's
we
so
just-
good to have you guys back. Don't melt.
Pardon?
don't melt, you said.
What?
Don't melt.
You just said, 'cause it's so hot.
Oh,
All right, I'll see you guys later. Thank you.
All right,
Okay,
bye-bye.
Love you all.
see you Sunday for sure.
all right. Yep, bye-bye.